All right, CNT140, we are working on our phone cabling lab. I downloaded a copy of my lab here as PDF. And in the first podcast, we went over how to actually do your phone cable termination, your phone patch cable termination. Make sure you do that. And when you're done, do make sure you take the picture or a couple second video showing your cable attached to the cable meter to get credit for this part of the lab. The podcast we're doing right now is going to start on part 2. If we're in the lab room, we would take that cable we just made and hook it into a phone and into a small business router we have in the room that's able to process phone calls. So we are now going to do that same kind of action on Packet Tracer, where we're going to hook up an analog phone, an IP phone, and a soft phone, and actually pass a little bit of traffic between them. So we are going to do a little bit of configuration here. But hey, let's have some fun. So here we go. I've downloaded the lab here. I obviously saved this PDF. I downloaded the Packet Tracer file, and I have that open and ready to go. To start off with, we're going to cable it up like I have on this map right here. All the cables are going to be copper straight through cables, except between the ATA here and the analog phone will be a phone cable, just like the one you just terminated, that flat, non-paired analog phone cable. So we are going to, let's grab a straight through cable here. We're going to go from the router as it shows you, the router 00 port down to port 4 on the switch. Port 4 on the switch. Okay, we normally use 24 in a lot of the labs. We're going to use 4 today. You'll see why in a minute. We're going to go from here to, we'll just go straight to, actually, I'm kind of going backwards here. Let's start over here on this side. We're going to go port 1 here to Ethernet on this guy. So let's go port 1 here. There we go, to Ethernet over here. We'll go another copper straight through. We're going to go port 2 here. And we're going to go to, there's just two ports on here, one for the switch and one for the PC. We're going to connect to the switch port. The PC port in here would allow you to go from the phone into a desktop PC in an office environment. We're just hooking the phone up for now. We're going to go port 3 here to the NIC on this guy. So those are all copper straight through cables. The only thing left is our analog cable to go from the ATA to our analog phone. And we will need this guy down here, this black and white dotted zigzag line. And it'll actually say phone on it if you hover over it. We're going to go from here, the phone side, into the phone port. And this is literally the cable that you just made. This is simulating the cable you just made. And what we have here real quickly is we have a PC that, as we're going to see in a little bit, on the desktop there is a soft phone on it that we're going to configure. We have an IP phone that's designed to just plug into the network and function. Last but not least, we have the analog phone, which would be just a regular desktop analog phone, connected into an ATA. This is going to translate the analog signals from here into packets to go into the network to talk to our phone processing on the router. All right, now that we have that done, we do need to do a little bit of switch configuration. So we're going to go into the switch right here, and we are going to open your command line, hit your enter key a couple times, and CNT125 people, this should look familiar or will be familiar to you soon. We're going to do config T or configure terminal. Let's give it a name. I think we're calling this guy, what are we calling this guy? Voice switch or something like that. Yeah, host name, voice switch. That'll work. We're going to take the first 4 ports and we're going to do something with them. So we're going to say interface range. And we're going to go FA0/1 is the first port, space dash space 4. So ports 1, 2, 4, we're going to do something with. We're going to say we want these to be access mode, not trunk mode. 125 people, that might sound familiar or will sound familiar to you soon. Switch port mode access. Okay, we don't want this to be trunk, we want it to be access mode. An access device is going to connect to it. We're then going to say we want them to be in VLAN 1, which they actually are right now, but we need to signal the switch that voice devices are being plugged in. So when we do switch port voice VLAN 1, it lets the switch know, switch port voice VLAN 1, to treat them as a phone device is plugged into them. Okay, so then we'll say exit, exit, and that's really the only config we need to do. I'll do a show run here real quick and show you. Here's our name of the switch, and here is the first handful of ports that we signaled, hey, voice devices are going to be plugged into them. Okay, so treat them appropriately, and the rest we have done nothing to. So we'll just do a copy run start on this guy. Excellent. And while I'm at it, before I go too much further, I'm going to go here and I'm going to do a file save as on this guy. File save as. I'm just going to make sure he goes to the desktop. There we go. And I will go something like Brown Phone Cable Lab Packetry. So there you go. Nice and simple. Now, as I go, I can be saving progress on there as well. So there's my switch config. We're going to move into the router config next. So on the router, we're going to do a little bit of configuration. We'll do some basic config, and then we'll do some specific config. So on the router, let's console in again. Enable config T. 125 people. This should be looking really familiar to you by now. We've done a couple of these labs already with the routers. So let's give this guy a name as well. So we'll say host name, and we'll say he's voice router, I think is the name we're using in this lab. Voice router. There we go. We want to configure the fast Ethernet 00 port. So interface fast Ethernet 0/0. IP address on this guy, 192.168. If we look at the map, it should be 1.1. That should be the address we're using. 1.1 with a default class C subnet mask. So follow that with 255.255.255.0. And there is the IP address in that port, and we'll do no shutdown to turn this port on. That port should now be functioning. If I look at my map, I see it go green. Eventually that port will settle. So there is my name and my IP address. We now need to, we're going to get into some more interesting stuff on here. We need to configure a DHCP scope on here. That way it hands out IP addresses to anything attached to it. Because things like the ATA and the IP phone, I like to joke they're dumb devices. They don't know what to do. We have to tell them what to do. So we need to hand out IP addresses to them. So to do that, we're going to create an IP DHCP Pool scope. But before we even do that, we're going to hold back a couple addresses that do not get handed out. Those are usually held back for things like router interfaces, switch IP addresses, printers, servers, those kind of things. So we don't want to hand out the first handful of numbers. So we're going to put an exclusion in, IP DHCP excluded address, and we're going to put a range of numbers. So the first IP will be the first one we hold back, 192.168.1.1. The second number we plug in is the end of that range, 192.168.1.50. So I'm basically saying, hey, hold back these first 50 IP addresses, don't hand them out. So now when we create the scope, it's automatically going to hold those back and not pass them out. And actually, I think I should have been in that mode right there. There we go. So next thing we need to do, IP DHCP Pool, and we can give it a name, because we can create multiple pools in here. So we'll call this one voice for all the voice devices. We want to identify the network. The network number on this guy is 192.168.1.0, followed by the subnet mask. We then need to tell it, hey, where's the default router? What's the address of the default router? Well, the default router on this one is actually the address of the router port, 192.168.1.1. We also need to, oops, if I spell correctly, that would help, right? Don't feel bad. If you make typos, you've joined my club. All right, after the default router, we also need to do a special command called option 150. Option 150 tells things like soft phones and IP phones where to get their phone configuration from. So we're going to say option 150 IP, and again, we're going to plug in the address of the router. That's all we need. It's in that way, phones and soft phones know where to get their configuration from. Okay, what I'm going to do now, let's take a look at our running config. Here is our excluded addresses. There's our DHCP pool. Here's our IP address. We're off and running. All right, let's put in now some general telephone configuration or telephony configuration. So general telephony configuration is the general things. Basically turning on the phone processing and setting a couple general parameters. So config T again. I'm going to do the telephony service command that basically says, okay, turn on telephony service if you will, and we're going to configure things in it. So we're going to say max ePhones. Oops, I need to put a number behind there. This would be, hey, there's only going to be 10 on here. And I also need, and this is actually, ePhones are, that's the router name for the actual physical IP phones or devices we have in the network. The max DN are directory numbers. So these would be phone numbers for Doug Brown or phone numbers for Bill Smith or Sally Jones, okay? So max DN is going to be 10. We also want to say, hey, don't let these phones auto-register. That can be a problem. So no auto reg phone, ePhone, excuse me. We won't let the phones register themselves. That can actually be a headache. They register themselves and they get stuck in there almost like a splinter in your finger and they're hard to get out. So Ipsource Address, this says, hey, all your phone processing and phone configuration is going to come from this source. In our case, again, it's the router port, 192.168.1.1. And we also need to indicate the port number. What port number are we using for phone configuration? In this case, is port 2000. That is the port number for SCCP. Our Cisco phones use SCCP for setup. So we need to indicate that. And now we're going to do create CNF files. These are the little XML files that get sent to phones to display company name or phone number on the screen. So we're saying, hey, also display that or create that and send that to the phones. So we have the general router configuration. We have the Dhcp scope now. And now we have general phone configuration. Okay. We'll come back on the next one. We're going to do some specific phone configuration for the ePhones. We'll do that next podcast.